manager at a national civic advocacy organization dedicated to building political power for the Muslim American community. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this pivotal conversation on the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Right now, we're at a critical moment in time. So April marks the second year since the start of the war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, which has killed over 150,000 Sudanese. And I want to just take this moment to say that these numbers may be severely underreported. And over 14.6 million Sudanese have been forced from their homes. Hunger has reached catastrophic levels in Sudan, with 1.3 million children at risk of famine and 770,000 suffering from severe acute malnutrition, putting them at risk of death. Violence continues to devastate communities across the country. Just last week, the RSF brutally attacked Al-Fashir, the capital of North Darfur, as well as the Zamzam and Abu Shuk refugee camps. It's killed over hundreds of internally displaced people, including aid workers, women, children, and the elderly who have nowhere else to go. So this humanitarian crisis is staggering, and yet it remains largely absent from global headlines and underaddressed by policymakers. Last week, as part of our Sudan Advocacy Week, we mobilized and met with over 46 lawmakers. We asked them to push and act for Sudan-focused legislation, including the Stand Up for Sudan Act and the U.S. Engagement in Sudanese Peace Act, asked them to advocate for humanitarian access and to make Sudan a priority in U.S. foreign policy. And it was a powerful demonstration of what collective action can achieve, but it also reminded us that sustained strategic advocacy is crucial to keeping Sudan on the agenda. So that brings us to today's conversation. What I'm asking, and I'm sure most of you have been wondering, how and why was the 2003 Save Darfur Campaign so successful in capturing global attention and mobilizing political will? What can we learn from the victories and the successes of that campaign, as well as its shortcomings, to better advocate for Sudan today? So we have an incredible panel lined up to help us unpack these questions. We're joined here today by Professor Rebecca Hamilton, who is a professor at law at American University, Washington College of Law, teaching international law, national security law, and criminal law. She's an executive editor at Just Security and is an internationally recognized expert on atrocity prevention. Her 2011 book, Fighting for Darfur, did a deep dive into the US-based citizen advocacy movement and the United Nations, African Union, and US policy processes. If you haven't read the book, you should, because it's fantastic. Previously, Professor Hamilton served as a lawyer in the prosecutorial division of the International Criminal Court. Prior to entering academia, she worked as a journalist covering Sudan for the Washington Post and Reuters. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School. Quscondy Abdulshafi is the senior regional advisor at Freedom House, with over a decade of experience advancing governance, democracy, and human rights in Africa and the US. His work focuses on inclusive governance, civil society strengthening, and policy advocacy. He previously served as the Research and Advocacy Fellow. Quscondy has led peace building and human rights efforts across Sudan, Ethiopia, and Uganda, including African Center for Justice and Peace Studies and Sudan Democracy First Group. He began his activism at the University of Khartoum, where he co-founded the Darfur Students Movement. In recognition of his leadership, he received the Civil Society Leadership Award from the Open Society Foundation in 2016. He holds dual master degrees in Sustainable International Development and Coexistence and Conflict Resolution from Brandeis University and a BA in Development Studies at Kampala International University. Mike Brand is a human rights, atrocity prevention, and peace-building professional with nearly 2 decades of experience in policy advocacy, organizing, and education. Throughout his career, Mike has worked for NGOs in the US, Rwanda, South Sudan, and has done fieldwork in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. Mike supports civil society organizations and diaspora networks in strategic planning, program development, and achieving their advocacy and organizing objectives. In addition to his policy and advocacy work, Mike is an adjunct professor of mass atrocities prevention and human rights at Georgetown University and the University of Connecticut. He holds an MA in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University with a concentration in human rights and atrocities prevention and a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Political Science with a minor in human rights from the University of Connecticut. And finally, Omer Ismail was born in the Darfur region of Sudan. He has spent over 20 years working independently and with international organizations on relief efforts and human rights. Omer fled Sudan in 1989 as a result of his political views. He helped founded the Sudan Democratic Forum, a think tank of Sudanese intellectuals working for the advancement of democracy in Sudan. In addition, he co-founded the Darfur Peace and Development Organization to raise awareness about the crisis in his troubled region. He currently works as a policy advisor to several agencies working in crisis management and conflict resolution in Africa. He was also a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University's Kaiser Center for Human Rights Policy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hamilton.
Thank you so much for convening this conversation. It's such a difficult and important time to be addressing this topic. So I think as we look back at the 2003, really starting 2004 Save Darfur movement, it is easy from this particular vantage point to see that as sort of unimaginable success, because we're in a situation today where we have such horror unfolding, continuing to unfold on the ground, without what feels like anywhere close to the attention that is needed. And something that early Save Darfur movement did very well was get the attention of policymakers. However, not to be too bleak right at the outset, but I wouldn't call that movement actually fundamentally a success. So I want to just give you both the ups and downsides of that history, because I think it's really informative to how we think about how we might move forward today. So a little bit of background, which is to say that the movement really kicked into high gear in the US public space around the 10th anniversary of the Rwanda genocide, which is to say April of 2004. Why does that matter? Certainly not because what happened in Rwanda and what was happening in Darfur were in any way the same. You have completely different geographies, history, demographic, people, root causes. However, in the 10 years that followed the Rwandan genocide, there was a very powerful narrative that had grown up around what that tragedy had meant in terms of the role of US, just everyday US citizens and other people living in the US. And it was popularized in Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell. And the story was that if only there had been an outcry, then that genocide could have been stopped. Now, whether that's actually true, we'll never know. It's a counterfactual argument, but certainly it was the case that there was no US outcry over Rwanda. And so the case was made that if there had been an outcry, then you could have saved lives and potentially stopped genocide in Rwanda. So that narrative became the basis for what then 10 years later became the Save Darfur movement. As we were finally starting to get some solid reporting of atrocities that were happening in Darfur around 2004, the connection was made to the story about what role should Americans in particular play when genocide is unfolding somewhere else in the world. And so with a commitment to not letting Rwanda be repeated, we had this burst of advocacy that was coming from several different places at once, but part of the backbone of it was a youth advocacy movement, students, as always, taking on a leadership role and trying to create the outcry that Rwanda hadn't had. Now, the upside was that you had a deep commitment and energy and really effective engagement across a very broad coalition that brought in churches, that brought in a whole host of faith organizations, actually, along with students, along with ordinary civil society, committed to this message that if you just raise your voice, you could stop genocide. The downside, however, were these were people that had no background for the most part in Sudan. Now, there were exceptions to this, and it changed over time as the movement became more sophisticated and started to realize the importance of engaging people who had a deep background knowledge of Sudan and of all the factors that led to the moment that was happening in Darfur in 2003 and 2004. But that took a bit of time to build that coalition. And still, I think there weren't Sudanese sort of at the front and center of the movement for the most part, right? And we have some of the exceptions to that general rule on this call. But it wasn't grounded in Sudan. It was very much a movement that was grounded in the US because of this theory of if you could get the US government to act, then you could stop a genocide. So the successes of that were tens of thousands of lives saved through the humanitarian aid that was delivered. You had hundreds of millions of dollars in humanitarian aid that far outstripped any other crisis that was happening at the time. And that was because you had the full and really true engagement of congressional champions who were hearing from their constituents every time that there was funding coming up in the humanitarian aid cycle. So wildly different to what we have today on many levels. And again, it was easy at the time to think, well, that was just a Band-Aid, and it was, but it was a Band-Aid that saved lives. And I think if we compare that to today, it would be really nice to at least get that back again. What it didn't do, however, what it couldn't do was get to the underlying issues. And I think, you know, I will sort of stop my remarks here so that we can bring in everybody else. But I think that if we had had more of that energy invested in Sudanese civil society, who at the end of the day are the only people who stick with this over the long term. And again, Quscondy and Omer here on the call are testament to that. It is very hard to maintain the engagement of a purely volunteer civil society in the United States unless they believe that what they're doing is really making a difference. And if you don't get to root causes, it's hard to demonstrate that ultimately you're making a difference. And so eventually people got tired. There were other crises. They had competing demands on their time. And it is only Sudanese civil society itself that stayed engaged to the point that we are today. So I can jump back in more with later, but hopefully that provides an overview.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor. I did, before we move on, have one question, a follow-up before we move on. And I wanted to ask, it was something you mentioned in your book about Colin Powell's genocide determination. It came during the conflict rather than after the fact, which was, I think you mentioned, the first time in history where this happened. Do you think that made any sort of impact on the efforts the US took following the genocide determination, or did it really make no difference?
So where it made a difference was for civil society activists because of the Rwanda narrative, and it was the message could be really clear. We need to do this to stop what is happening, which is a genocide. Actually, in terms of the US government, you know, it's hard to disentangle because they were already quite strongly engaged because of the civil society effort. And so they were pulling on as many levers as they felt they had available. Where they hit a hard stop or a ceiling was when it came to any policy that could contravene other US national security interests, and at that time, particularly the US relationship with China. And even the label of genocide wasn't enough to get over that hurdle. But it did mean that you were able to keep the humanitarian aid flowing and keep the engagement of policymakers.
Thank you so much. I will say it's a little uncanny that some of the stuff that you're saying right now is what we see even today. But with that, I'm going to pass it along to Quscondy to provide your remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you everyone. And really, it's very difficult to kind of follow up after Rebecca and just give some more detail. I think I would basically be saying this because I was one of the people who are inside the Sudan in the movement. So we have very less knowledge of what was happening with the Save Darfur globally. But generally, what we say, like what the clear impact of that campaign, particularly the good lessons learned is, there was clear messaging, very simple, Save Darfur or not in our watch, which was very, clear messaging that was simple to be able to get results very easily. And that was helpful to create a more large mobilization, particularly in US, Europe, and other countries. And it also trickled down as a way to create the Darfur Consortium, which played a key role into mobilization within the African policy framework, and also Arab Coalition for Darfur, which was also working on the Middle East. So these are kind of just general impacts of the 2003 campaign. And one of the biggest success was also that campaign was made the first, was able to make the first ever the UN Security Council submitting a case to ICC. It wasn't happening. It was unanimous vote to refer Darfur 2006, I think, in 2006, to refer the case to Darfur. And all US, China, Russia, everyone unanimous, except US condition that I am not going to fund it. But generally was unanimous passing of that. And I think, there was clear messaging. There was also the movement, as Rebecca said, was more kind of helpful on that. I think one of the things also that there was, particularly within the US, there was 2002 Sudan Peace Act, which was bipartisan. It was easy to, and that is where most other Sudanese also think that, more campaign on Sudan was because US also want to pressure Bashir more to accept the South Sudan secession and others. But generally, I think it was very impactful at the moment. I think one of the major shortcoming was lack of connection. For instance, we had the same time when the Colin Powell came, thousands of us Darfuris and all the Sudanese students, protested on Khartoum, like, we are being stormed by police, hundreds being arrested, but there was no connection, no knowledge, no kind of coordination about what is happening. There was very restricted authoritarian situation, but within that, the students have died, large numbers as part of that movement. But there was no connection between what's happening even within the Sudanese diaspora and Sudanese inside, which was mostly only students in the university. There was no clear connection. I think one of the things also there was a bit oversimplification, because before Sudan campaign was, in America particularly, was, Muslims in the north killing Christian in the south. And that was also oversimplification. When the Darfur started, was Arabs killing Africans. And it was easy, but it was also oversimplification that make it a bit problematic on how to continue. One of the second challenge, which was very clear, is after 2008, the US administration more leaned toward, compromising and negotiation. And that also weakened the impact, particularly, the impunity become always, come on the table as part of any peace deal, which makes, weaken the movement itself. So I think with all that said, I think currently what I'm seeing it is just not, there is a lot of particularly problems within how do we package the problem, and this the issue itself, the campaign itself. The messaging is not clear, but also the voices are a bit shattered when it comes to the particularly the not only international but also within the Sudanese, and that come into how the Sudanese organization and political parties having that conversation during the beginning of this new crisis. And I think that is being transferred until now, where you can find sometimes some of people who were very vocal in 2003 genocide currently are very very disappointing when it comes to their position to kind of stand openly, and that really has played a setback into a civilian campaign of the Sudanese civil society itself, but also that also trickling down into the global campaign to clearly address the issues going. I think compared to 2003 genocide, yes, that was very deadly and was concentrated in certain area. But this war is more deadly and it is more, dynamic. Means that you have Al-Fashir just only, you have a Janina, you have Al-Fashir, you have Al Jazeera, and we don't know what next could look like. So it comes in a multifaceted, and it comes into different geographies, and it has different dynamics. There can be a political, ethnic dynamics, or center periphery dynamics, or riverite, non-riverite dynamics, or militia defective dynamics, which is all combine it into this, which is make it very difficult to say, oh, I can create one sort of messaging that fit within all of these chaos that happen. And I think that's the homework for all of us to really kind of think about how do we re-strategize this. And we have a lot of tools that we didn't have in 2013, which is advanced access to internet, digital media that is very easy, to mobilize, to connect with the local actor, to bring Sudanese civil society into the center, into the driving seat of the movement, at least where possible, to actually be able to reimagine the new launching of campaign, how that will look. How do we, incentivize African civil society, which is currently very silent, similarly as the African Union, to actually be able to come back or come up into the. So I think that those are general, but the specific problem with the US also, like kind of to create a mobilization now, it's a bit very much difficult. Based on the political landscape, it doesn't look like what it was in 2013. And sometimes it becomes very difficult, when the even the humanitarian issue, there's a lot of mercantilistic view of, human rights and democracy issues. When you're trying to talk about the issue on Sudan and you see who are the external actors that influencing the crisis there, it is, sometimes you can easily get, deaf ears. And I think we really need to re-strategize, and always going down to grassroots, even within the US, is always more workable and more helpful. Over.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that was a really good overview. I did want to ask one question. One thing you had highlighted was the oversimplification challenge. I think in 2003, you saw more of an easy good versus bad narrative. And this was something that the former special envoy to Sudan, Don Perello, mentioned. We don't have this easy, packageable, good versus bad narrative in today's conflict. Do you think that's do you agree with this statement? Do you think that because there isn't that simplistic narrative, it's made it harder for people to get involved or even want to become involved? You still on mute.
Yeah, the lack of the key problem was the lack of, because the campaign in 2003 was built by the stories of the victims, meaning that the campaign itself was more humanized than now. Now it's more politicized. We hardly listen to the real story of people who have today left Al-Fashir. And I think what we really need to rehumanize, to bring the stories of the real people down, to build our campaign. And I think that that will help with unifying the message. There are three things. One, we need immediate access, the humanitarian access, which is one a very, very clearly actionable call. And within that comes who is hindering, who are their names, how they're hindering, and how can we stop them as individual or as groups. And then another action is to stop, mass atrocities that are currently happening, particularly war on civilians and other external actors that are spoiling this conflict. We know them and we know how they do that. and at least that campaign can go around that. And the third is accountability. This is which 2003 failed to achieve that accountability aspect. And how do we reimagine that? How do we reconfigure that call? I think those are like the only way for us to go back or to get back on track. Otherwise, will be less humanized, it will be more political, and it will be less convincing, not only to the public, but also to the key targeted policymakers that we want to convince.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass it along to Mike.
Thanks. And I don't know how much more I can add. I'll just say I think it's important to note at the time, there was a whole ecosystem of organizations working on Darfur specifically, and they had a priority focus on Darfur while other organizations were working on several different, crises. And today, we don't really have that anymore. At the time you had the Save Darfur Coalition, which included several independent organizations, faith-based organizations, churches, synagogues, and mosques across the country. And they were able to raise millions of dollars for a variety of campaigns. You had the Holocaust Memorial Museum that was heavily involved, the Genocide Intervention Network, STAND, which was the Students Taking Action Now Darfur, mobilizing thousands of students across the country. The Enough Project and several other, organizations and individuals that were dedicating their time and resources to specifically addressing this crisis. Today, like I said, we don't really have that. We have a lot of different organizations, some of whom are dedicating a lot of time to the crisis right now in Sudan, but they're splitting that time with several other crises that are happening, unfortunately. So, that focused attention at the time from different avenues, different organizations, and all of them kind of pitching in different ways really helped to mobilize at a level that we're not seeing today. And, I know Rebecca said that it was around 2004, the anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, that things started to pick up. And, you saw Colin Powell calling it a genocide then. But in my opinion, I think really you saw a turning point in 2006, 2007. And at that point, and the reason why I say that is, that's when you saw the major Save Darfur rally on the Mall in Washington, D.C. That was April 2006. You had, celebrities, members of Congress, thousands of people in attendance. You had another major rally that occurred in Central Park in New York. There were also, smaller rallies across, the country. At the time, there was a huge, student conference that also brought, hundreds of students from across the country to DC to lobby their members of Congress. You had the Genocide Intervention Network launched, the 1-800-Genocide tool, which was the first kind of thing of its kind that allowed people to quickly just call this number, get information on, what's the latest ask, what's the latest situation, and then directly connect people with their members of Congress, with, their governor, with the White House switchboard. And, now we have a lot of different, tools, every action and, various different like, click to text kind of, things. Back then we didn't have that as much. So, having those kinds of tools at the time really allowed people a quick and easy way to take action. They had the genocide scorecards, trying to see how people were doing in Congress, if they were voting for the right bills or not. This way you can kind of hold their feet to the fire a little bit. And then you had conferences kind of at different universities across the country that were bringing students together to also share ideas, getting involved. And it was brought to the highest levels, right? I mean, people may forget, but during the 2008 presidential election, the Save Darfur Coalition got on-record video interviews with all of the major candidates. You had Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain all in a video talking about what they would do as president if they were elected to, address the situation in Darfur. They also got a letter that was signed by all of the presidential candidates. So I think there's just a different level of pressure and involvement. And you also saw, a level of bipartisanship in Congress that was really strong. There were several different bills and resolutions that were either introduced or passed the House or the Senate, and a few key things that ended up passing and being signed into law, including the Darfur, Peace and Accountability Act, Sudan Accountability and Divestment Act, and a few others. So, all of these things kind of coming to a head around that time period was also around the time that a lot of that pressure was also leading to UNAMID being deployed. So the UN force in Darfur, which, we can have a whole conversation about the effectiveness of that in and of itself. But, today there's really not an active conversation about deploying a new peacekeeping, mission into Sudan. And when you think too, at the time, if 2003, you argue 2003 or 2004 is when the genocide really began in earnest. By the time that the peacekeeping mission was deployed in 2008, that's a pretty big gap, right? That's 3 to 4 years of advocacy and action and, mobilization and all these things. And also by then, a large, majority of the violence and atrocities had taken place. A lot of the displacement, or not that it ended then, but, a significant portion of the initial violence against civilians in Darfur happened in those years before UNIT ever, stepped foot in Darfur. So, I think as much as we all are advocating for more to be done now, it did take several years of advocacy and engagement and consistent pressure and support from Congress, support from the international community in different ways, to get that level of UN Security Council action. I think also, something that's a little different from then till now is I remember being at a conference, in DC back then. I'm pretty sure it was JP, who I see is on the call, as well as a bunch of other friends here, who at the time said, that the anti-genocide movement was fortunate because we didn't have a pro-genocide lobby to deal with. We really just had to deal with apathy and indifference, and that was already like, two enemies that were hard to overcome. And I think today, we have pro-genocide lobbies, right? We have the UAE that is directly involved in arming and supplying arms to the RSF, that is actively lobbying not just the US, but others, and involved in a variety of different ways. We have different other countries and individuals that are directly benefiting from the war and the instability that are actively engaged in lobbying and engaging with, not just the US, but also in the EU and other African regional partners. So, it's not just, that we need to educate more people and get them more aware, but we're also dealing with these other, forces at play. And it's an uphill, battle. I think today, it's difficult to imagine, despite that we have, much more social media, we have a lot more ability to get this information out in front of people, even though, as you said, Hannah, the news media is not covering the crisis in Sudan as much as anybody would like. It's probably more in some ways than it was in the early 2000s because there's just more of it. There's more media options, there's more independent coverage, there's more social media coverage, there's people that are talking about it, and still, we have people that don't really know what's going on. And I think at its height, in that 2006, 2007 window, I remember being on the subway in New York, going to that rally that I mentioned in Central Park, wearing a Save Darfur shirt, and thinking, okay, well, like this is the height. There's thousands of people that are going to rally here and everything. And somebody on the subway asked me, "Who's Darfur?" So I think we had challenges then, and it's even worse now.
I think that's a very good overview, especially of the media coverage, which has been currently such an issue. Our attention, our time, money, efforts, in a way, as you mentioned, have been forced to be split. So there's a number of genocides and mass atrocities that are occurring concurrently, including, the Rohingya in Burma, the Palestinians, and of course in Sudan. Are there ways that we can divide our efforts and time to successfully advocate for all of these issues? Or are we stuck in a situation where we're forced to prioritize, what comes first and what comes next?
I mean, I think it's a great question. I think everybody has to choose what they're working on. And, for some of us, we try to work on all of the above as much as we can. But this is also an issue for governments and for the UN Security Council and for regional bodies like, the African Union and IGAD and others. They're competing with these different crises simultaneously, and refugee response and humanitarian situations. So it's an uphill battle, not just to capture the attention of activists and advocates and the news media, but also policymakers that have the ability to do something about the situation.
Thanks so much for that. And I'm going to finally pass it to our last panelist, Omer Ismail.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks to your organization and the allies And thanks to everyone who's attending this, listening to us, and perhaps contributing. Speaking last is always a challenge because, most of the stuff has been said. However, I'm trying to emphasize some of the points that were discussed by my colleagues. And I will begin by saying the Save Darfur coalition, if it brought anything, it brought what is in the name itself, the coalition, bringing people together to work. The last time that people heard of genocide in the United States or elsewhere was the genocide of the Second World War, and then the genocide in Rwanda, which was, to my knowledge, was not determined by countries and governments, but it was rather something that most organizations and people talked about it. Here, we see that this coalition led to the determination of genocide. And that in itself is an achievement. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat the stuff that happened, and I will speak about the challenges in 1 or 2 points. But that leads me to my second point, which is the mobilization of international actors and the humanitarian organizations. That mobilization was huge. I remember, and John Prendergast is here, and others, and with Rebecca, and bringing people like Samantha Power and Professor Eric Greaves, we crisscrossed the United States, speaking in rallies, engaging with students. The think tanks that were more conservative and discussing things that are mostly related to, things that are happening in the United States or globally in Europe, found themselves engaged in bringing in an issue that happened in Africa and which is the forgotten continent mostly, and that is an important thing to happen, and also I believe strengthening the role of civil society, specifically the diaspora aspect of it, to find the Sudanese diaspora engaged with faith-based organizations, churches, synagogues, like Mike was saying, and also engaging with the students, Stand and Stop Genocide Now, and many other organizations. I believe that gave us as Sudanese, the confidence to go out there and speak with these guys and get engaged and talk publicly about this and make Darfur, which was the issue, a household kind of discussion. I could go out there and give you many examples of places that I went to and people never heard of Darfur. I saw signs, I saw women and children, elderly people coming out and talking about this. One of the most important things also, they were engagement of the US policymakers in actions that led to expanding and giving more to humanitarian aid. I think that was very important, even though the policies fell short of addressing the issue of genocide properly as people were expecting, and that is one of the shortcomings. However, the diplomatic engagement was at top level. The divestment that was led by the students, and they starting taking score of companies that were engaged with the government of Sudan and trying to get divestment out of these companies and also universities. And they challenged actually big organizations and companies in the United States not to engage with the government of Sudan because it's a government that performed genocide. And finally, I think one of the most important things that happened at that time was the UN wasn't listening to the masses or the people. The UN is a club of countries, and to find people like myself and others going there and engaging and testifying in the US Security Council and in the US Congress and in the European Parliament, and this level of engagement with the people in these organizations that were limited only to governments and their representatives, that was a turning point in this thing. Let alone bringing in people who were happy going on with their other issues, like celebrities coming from their high style status and talking about this. A lot of people might have some criticism of that, but I think it was also a positive thing. The challenges are enormous. And the missed opportunities are there, but I will take 2 or 3. The limited sustained international pressure and enforcement of accountability. That was one of the most disturbing things, to see that a government declaring or making a call as hard and difficult as the word genocide, and using the G word as they used to say at the time. And in the same breath saying that that doesn't mean that we are going to do something. That was disappointing. And perhaps what we are going through today and what is happening in other parts of the world is encouraging the perpetrators, knowing that they can do this with impunity and there is no accountability in the world. That is maybe what has led to the other crisis besides what is happening in Sudan today. And maybe in the near future, if it is not addressed properly, is going to also to encourage other dictators and perpetrators to do the same. This is a huge challenge. When you go halfway and you stop short of going the extra mile or going to the 1 yard to the end zone, it's very frustrating to the people who are working there, and also the insufficient protection of civilians, and there is a huge gap in humanitarian access, and that is what we see today as well. Yes, UNIMED went there, and like Mike and Quscondy was saying, we can talk about the successes and the failures of UNIMED, but at that time it was an attempt to protect civilians. However, we did not give them the budget that is proper for this. We did not give them the equipment. I remember the helicopters issues, and other equipment that is important for the enforcement of that peacekeeping. And the last point on that is, we have to make sure that there is peace to keep before we go to peacekeeping. And that means we have to exert a lot of effort to put into diplomatic engagement that is going to lead these people to peacekeeping, and to stop the attempts like what government of Sudan had done at the time, that is like forum shopping. They go to Abuja, they didn't like it, and then they go to Doha and they didn't like it, and they go to somewhere else, to the extent that some of my colleagues counted about 40 something attempts on a peace agreement, and this piecemeal agreements that will never work, and the agreements that used to actually become a source of some of these warlords to be engaged in getting or gaining positions in governments, and the governments are happy to select 1 or 2 of these notorious warlords and to make them ministers and to give them portfolios in these governments, and that is not peace. So when we look at this and we see the fragmented diplomatic engagement and the lack of coordination and coherence, and also the lack of long-term strategy that is addressing the issues of peace agreement, then we are talking about some serious challenge that is there and overshadow all the efforts that are there from the grassroots to see their representatives, their governments engaged, and they are coming up with sound policies that are going to lead to positive results. So it's a mixed feelings for me being there when all this thing started and seeing it until today. going through all these years and seeing that the ICC was not actually given the chance to do what they do best. There were one or two cases there that went, and there is a case of Quscondy that is going on now. We cannot blame the ICC for all these failures, but also they don't have the tools of enforcement. Is that going to become something that the world is going to look at? And we have to get institutions with teeth to have a bite, and to be able to enforce what we agreed on. That is something, that is one. And the other thing is to encourage governments that the genocidaires or the governments that engage in this kind of action should be ostracized and should be stopped from engaging in the international organizations. We've seen, some of these people are engaged in the regional meetings and like the EU and others. This has to stop, and the world should learn its lessons, that we cannot go halfway and stop short of reaching the goals, and to have strategies and to have diplomatic engagements that work and that will bring us sound policies that will end this kind of behavior once and for all. Back to you.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview. And of course, I have 1,000 follow-up questions. However, I do want to be cognizant of our time and of everyone's ability to stay on. So I'm actually going to pass it to our participants. If there were any questions that you have, please let me know. Either you can write it in the chat function or just raise your hand, and we'll give you the option to speak. So I know Mohammed has had his hand up for a while, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask your question. So you should have the ability to ask what you wanted to ask. Right, maybe we might have to come back to him. But was there anyone else that had any questions in our audience? Feel free to either raise your hand, it might be a little bit easier, or just write it in the chat function.
I see three questions now in the Q&A.
Iman, do you mind just grabbing those because they're not showing on my end?
No problem. We have one for Omar. Can you speak a bit about your time in Sudan in government, about why the government could not hold from Save Darfur, this is from a colleague at Save Darfur. And the question was if you could speak about your time in Sudan in government and why the government could not hold, for Omar.
Thank you very much. It's a long story. We had our own challenges in the government. The government was a coalition between the military and the civilians, and it was a government that was temporarily there as a transitional government. And in transitional governments, they're like a government that is working to stabilize the situation in the country, to address the issues of the terrible economic situation in Sudan, providing goods and services to the people, taking care of the issue of refugees and displaced and all that. The challenges that we faced in that government were enormous. That is one. And the second thing is, with all that, we tried very hard to deliver the services to the people, to engage with the international community, to lift Sudan of the list of aiding terrorists. And that was a big hurdle that stopped Sudan from engaging with international institutions. We addressed the issue of debt in the Paris conference, which was a conference unlike many of the Sudanese expected that we will go to Paris and come back with truckloads of money. For us, it was labeling Sudan, reintroducing it to the international community. And we managed to do that. And we had engagements that led to Sudan reaching at the decision point in about 8 months, the fastest. It's a record in the international financial institutions until today. And also to address the issue of debt, and there was between maybe 12 to 14 billion dollars that were going to be forgiven, and also Sudan managed to get a few more billions of dollars until the time the people who staged the coup found that the coffers of the government is unlike when we got to the government, when we have a few tens of millions of dollars, like 52 millions to be exact, and we left behind like 2.6 billion dollars in the Bank of Sudan. So these are issues that were immediate and important. The issue of accountability was also important. We faced some of the challenges that threatened to destroy the coalition, and at the end of the day, our colleagues in the military side staged a coup to prevent us from doing this. We brought in the chief prosecutor into Sudan. We opened an office of the ICC in Sudan, and we were in the process of sending out the people that were indicted by the ICC, but we faced a lot of challenges. There is no time for me to tell you in details what happened, but the fact remains that our government tried its best among a lot of challenges inside and outside the country to do our best. We were not given the chance to reach the finish line. Unfortunately, were cut off by the military coup, which, in my understanding, was one of the reasons that we went to this war and we hurt the country. I think now is the time for the world to call on stopping this war and helping the civilians in bringing aid and bringing people back to where they belong and rebuild the country and move forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Our second question is from Sarah Elizabeth Dill, who's a human rights lawyer and vice chair of the International Bar Association War Crimes Committee. She says, thank you to all of you for all of your efforts. There are a number of efforts presently here in the UK, including Parliament and civil society as to Sudan. This coming week includes 2 hearings on Sudan. Can and should we be better coordinating and cooperating as to government advocacy efforts and public awareness campaigns on an international scale, and how can we do this? And I think this question is for everyone.
I was just going to jump in and say, I mean, the answer is yes and yes. One of the sort of things that was brilliant about the earlier campaign was to have an overarching slogan and message that could then, within which could sort of form an umbrella within which a whole lot of disparate actions could take place, and yet people could still feel as though they were part of a single movement. So the idea of not on our watch did that. And so I think having some unifying theme that there are lots of people all over the world who still care about Sudan, but you only get the visibility and you only get to see the breadth of that whole if there are some unifying slogans. And I'm always a little bit conflicted about a unifying slogan because you run into the oversimplicity problem and then you have to manage expectations. But just given where we are now with the lack of attention, that is one way to get there, and it is fairly straightforward. And I just wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that this is sort of so much more complicated than it was before. I think at the end of the day, we still have the quote unquote good actor to center here, and that is the civilians on the ground. And anyone who engages with them and their stories can feel buy-in to the issue through that. And we just need to convince people that they can make a difference. Let me just say, in terms of, I don't know what the unifying message is, but it does seem very clear to me is in terms of sort of sequencing strategically is that as long as money and weapons continue to flow in from outside actors, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get to a next step of even thinking about how you would bring those actors inside Sudan around the table. And so messaging that goes to that would for my money, be the starting point.
Thanks so much. Did either of you want to jump in before I move on to the next question?
I'll save my time for the next question.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh, apologies. If you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just quickly on the action. I think mostly what we need, just to add on what Rebecca said on the more kind of coordination and storytelling, but also like kind of how do we, this is unlike like 2003 where it was no really very direct, external influence as it is now, being able to highlight that as now where food is not able to come to the camps until now, the guns are flowing very easily. And I think that is very, very painful to see this happens in this kind of a scale. Is unprecedented. But I think one of the things that is needed, I think to have more consistency, I think global coalition and international coordination on, days of actions on Sudan, rallies, teach-ins, social media campaign can be very much helpful to just continue the momentum, increase the visibility. Could be really good in mobilize some of the universities, faith communities and other engaged policymakers indirectly, not only us as an organization, but other constituencies to have, direct engagement and, more kind of building general kind of, coalition with other medias to increase, kind of a visibility and the stories of the survivors would really very much have, I think is something that's very much needed, especially, some of this now, the recent report, most of these new recent arms in Darfur are manufactured in Europe and coming from there. I think a campaign in UK would be very, very much helpful to highlight some of those, the negative impact of that, or on some of those, businesses on Darfur currently, and particularly the overall Sudan.
I would add to what my colleagues said. We need to increase funding for humanitarian relief and support the Sudanese civil society. This is crucial. Like Becca was saying, it is important that the Sudanese civil society and the Sudanese organizations on the ground will be empowered and given the opportunity to work together in a coalition of some sort, because they are fragmented now. We need to bring them together and give them the task of saving the country. And also, it is important that we engage the region in a diplomatic effort, not only for peace making or like this, Jeddah Forum or Manama or Riyadh or what have you. That is important. But equally important is to stop their negative involvement in Sudan. That is by, supporting one side or the other in this fight. When we cut off that support from both sides, from SAF and RSF, we will force them to listen to the voice of reason and get together. And also, we need to support the international accountability mechanisms. That is, there are so many tools that we can use there. Increase the sanctions, targeted sanctions, that is against individuals or organizations that are proven to be the perpetrators and continuing this violence in Sudan. And supporting these mechanisms are important not only to end this crisis, but also to serve as a warning to those people who are thinking of doing something similar in the future. Back to you.
Thanks so much for that. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much, Rebecca. I know you had to hop off for a meeting, but we appreciate all of your expertise. So we do have two more questions, if that's all right with our remainder of the panelists. I know we've already hit 4:03, so if people need to hop off, no worries. This is recorded, so any answers or anything that happens afterwards will be online for everyone to view. But if it's okay with our speakers, I do have one or two more questions, if that's okay. So from Kim Klet, she asked, and I think this is very relevant to the answers you've all been giving. Given the political climate in the US currently, what is the best way we can bring attention and aid to Darfur? I know that's a bit of a loaded question, but if any of you want to take a stab at it.
I'd love to. And thanks, Kim. Great to see you here. I think this is the challenge that we're dealing with, is that it's not as simple as in this political climate, because during the Biden administration also not a lot was done on Sudan, and it was extremely frustrating, especially given the fact that Biden, as a senator, was one of the strongest voices during the Darfur crisis 20 years ago, going so far as to call for a no-fly zone, calling for the use of NATO, and calling for even sending U.S. troops to deal with the genocide. So, kind of being absent when he was president, not really focusing on the protest movements in 2018, 2019, in the various coups that happened, and then also, once the war broke out, only until the final days kind of in office, really focusing on this. But I think, what we're seeing right now, historically, there had been such great bipartisan support in Congress. The Sudan caucus, bipartisan support on several different Sudan pieces of legislation, resolutions, many of which were passed either unanimously or almost unanimously, 20 years ago. And so today we are not only pushing against just generally everything we've said, competing with everything that's happening in the world, but also the destruction of USAID and all of the funding that's been going out the door, the complete reorganization potentially of the State Department. Trump has still not appointed an assistant secretary for Africa or a senior leadership for Africa at the National Security Council. There's no special envoy. So all these positions are empty. And as Hannah mentioned, a group of us were on the Hill all last week meeting with different offices, both Democrat and Republican, and several different offices had a lot of sympathy and empathy for the crisis. Generally we're asking really good questions about the aid that was going in, especially to local groups like the ERRs and others, trying to figure out ways to continue that. But, and we've heard multiple times, in private, there might be some Republicans that are asking questions or pushing back a little bit on some of these drastic cuts and, like I said, the destruction of U.S. aid. But in public, not saying anything, kind of just going along with it. And so I think that's the biggest problem, is we don't have that same kind of leadership, in Congress to stand up to this, but then also to speak out on behalf of the Sudanese people at the very base level to continue to provide humanitarian assistance that 100% has been saving lives, and without it, people will die. And I think, it's not enough, for these private messages, but they really need to, take some action. And we're seeing a little bit here and there. There is a bipartisan resolution that was introduced in the Senate by Senator Booker and Senator Rounds. And we'll see, I think, it'll be a really big test in the coming months on appropriations if Republicans do push back on some of these cuts and this reorganization strategy, or not. But to answer your question, I'll just say we need more pressure. We need more people making phone calls. We need more engagement. We just need more.
I think that really sums up our experiences on the Hill, is just how much more we need of everything. But I want to give the opportunity to both Mohammed and Mukhtar to raise your questions. I'll let them both speak their questions, and then from there, we'll let the speakers answer.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. As well, thank you for the panelists regarding this general overview. My name is Musbah Isa Muhammad, and I work with the organization called Awafi Sudanese organization. So my question is regarding the solidarity for the international community on the Sudan. war or Sudanese. And as you know that what's happening now in Sudan, it's not a news as well for the international review, where the same genocide, the same mass atrocities, the same patterns of the which is taken place in 2003 is repeated during this war, especially in Darfur region, where during that time the international community as well the civil society they take the lead for the campaigns where they highlighted what's happening in Darfur, and this was resulted on using the arresting warrant from the ICC, where now Ali Koshe is the procedures. But April war 2012, that solidarity wasn't being present. There is a lack of advocacy campaigns. The point that mentioned by Quscondy is understandable, the politicization of the civil society. But at the same time, we feel that the role of the international community seems to be very lack. There is no attention for what's happening for the people in Sudan, for the people in Darfur. So my question is, what is the reason behind this? Is it the interest for the countries, or the lack of the Sudanese in diaspora? This is the first part from the question. The second thing is experience for the Sudanese in diaspora, whom they lead the advocacy during the time for in 2006 and 3. So, what is the position for those people during this war? Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed Mukhtar. Mukhtar, your audio is on, but we can't hear your question.
Can you type your question into the chat?
Yeah, we'll let you type your question into the chat box. But in the meantime, if the rest of you just want to answer Mohammed's question.
I'll give it a try. Some parts of the question, my connection wasn't good. However, what I understood from it, where did that coalition go of 2004, 2005, and it is missing during this round of war in Sudan. And I would say one of the most important elements of this is that the different competing crises that is happening around the world. Maybe we have the Russia-Ukraine war, we have Gaza, we have other conflicts around the globe. One of them is also South Sudan. So this competing interests diverted attention from one side to another, and like Mike was saying, there will be people always thinking of one important question for them or a crisis that they go to. That is one. Number two, this mixed bag of failure and success of the early coalitions, but that should not stop us from doing this and again and correct the mistakes and the shortcomings and get engaged fully. Number three, the change of leadership in the United States, and of course any government that is coming in, the first 3-4 months, 6 months, they will pay attention to the domestic issues, and they will find their way in setting policies towards different things, and they have their priorities. And I don't think Sudan is, fully there on the top of the priorities of the policymakers of the United States at this point. Europe as well, having to deal with so many things, and also the American policy towards the rest of the world, including Europe. there is this lack of attention to what is happening in places like Sudan, but it's still they're the penholder, like in England, and they just have had a conference on Sudan, and there is the engagement of the region in Jeddah and elsewhere. It is important that we, the Sudanese, raise our voices, go back and look at these coalitions and try to resuscitate some of the dormant coalitions that took place before. We followed in the footsteps of the advocacy that was taking place for South Sudan at the time, and that is how the coalition looked at what happened with the faith-based organizations, and then we brought in the students and others into the coalition. So it is not difficult to go back and do the same, raising awareness, making sure that the American public, through the diaspora that is in America, and now we have the second generation of Sudanese diaspora that are educated in the United States, lived in the United States, understand the culture in the United States better than us. We came in as the first immigrants that were coming in. I think this is a huge advantage. We have to go back to them, talk to them about the importance of engaging with the world, not just Sudan, and in particular because that is where their families came from, that is where their heritage is, that is where their culture is, and enhance that kind of advocacy and bring it back to the forefront. Go talk to your representatives, get engaged with them, go to the US Congress and demand that the Congress give more space for hearing about Sudan. Get engaged with the State Department and the different organizations in the United States and the UN. Raise your voice, amplify the voices of those who have no voice, that are left behind in Sudan, and now they are suffering in this crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel, thank you, Omar. You really kind of elaborated more, just generally in brief, to just shortly answer what Mohammed mentioned. I think, the beyond the global landscape that is changed, I think we haven't really been able to pull the attention of media as much as a conflict. We had the Sudan problem had a lot of attention before, even during the revolution of 2008. But when this war broke out, I think, after a few months, we are not pulling up into the media story. So digital contents that are coming are very less. With the cutting of internet, but also the targeting of the people who are doing human rights documentation on the ground, like you, Muhammad, and others, into the front lines are being silenced. And I think the biggest challenge that is coming is not for the months that are past, but for the months that are coming, because most of the biggest funders who are supporting such efforts are now all closing out and running out of the money. And I think, we really need to re-strategize, the campaign and fix somehow to, some of those loopholes. But I think it is very difficult for the Sudan issue, like a conflict profile, despite the magnitude that is like, the largest crisis currently exists, to be able to achieve any success if we're thinking about comparative matters is just very difficult is there just less interest, and there's a lot of fatigue on Sudan. And I think we have to recognize and acknowledge that. And I think that is, which will be it's a starting point for re-strategizing the campaign, how that will look like. If you look for accountability, it's very difficult. There's only ICC, and it's very difficult to get good support in the US now. If you are looking for humanitarian access, even the European donors are, spending more money on the defense and cutting the budget. So I think we really, this is the time where we can actually reprioritize, and then that's why I like the idea of the 2003 Save Darfur Campaign, the grassroots elements. It is very easy to raise the money, to bridge a lot of gap by just being able to have well-informed audience at the community level, at the grassroots level across the world, and be able to do that. I think that is very much possible now. And I think need a lot of work, a lot of strategy, a lot of coordinated action between the actors, that including diaspora, international organization, and groups, to be able to work together to actually be able to launch that activities. But I think really things change. Situation changes, those are just realities are different. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for this also to be a new opportunity, new approach to solve this problem and address a new strategy for a campaign. But I think we can't sing the same way as 2011. We cannot even be able to sing the same way as 2018. We really need to think about how people perceive atrocities. Image and the things that are happening in Sudan now is absolutely heartbreaking. But those are not enough. You don't have enough, we don't have enough attention. We don't have enough resources. We don't have enough interest on the policymakers so far. That is a fact. That interest is very low. It doesn't exist. This conflict is not, internal Sudanese conflict as it was in 2003. It is also very much internationalized and regionalized. And for us, without having really clear, clear roadmap to kind of work with the policymakers to create, carrot and stick, something that can incentivize the actors, external and internal, to stop these atrocities. If we don't have that in place, it's very difficult. And to do that, to reach to that level, there's a lot of homework from the global campaign, Sudanese activists, diaspora group, international organization, to really put the act together with the knowledge that this is different situation, different interests, and we are dealing with a different context, absolutely different than before. Over.
Oh, thank you so much for that. These answers have been so informative. Really what's been happening has been such a tragedy. So it's good to see that so many people are interested, who want to get involved. But I do want to be cognizant of everyone's time. It's already 4:20. So Mukhtar, will follow up with you directly. And thank you so much for your time on the Hill last week, volunteering with us. But thank you to all of our speakers. You've done such a fantastic job. It's been so great to hear from all of you. This has been, like I mentioned, incredibly helpful, especially for everyone who's been advocating, who is looking to advocate and get more involved. And to all of our participants, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to our speakers. And thank you for the extra time that you've taken. We'd love to keep in touch with all of you. Please make sure to follow Engage Action for all of our Sudan advocacy work, as well as our other work. And we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You all.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.